Hi guys, I hope everybody had a great day today. I know a lot of kids went back to school, so hopefully everybody had a great first day of school if you went back. We're actually going to dive into hoop school, or more specifically, a really easy hoop hack for hooping your fabrics and keeping things centered and lined up for machine embroidery using this clover basting tape. The reason I like this basting tape is that it's double-sided, so it comes in a roll like this. You can see my roll's been well used. This is probably my second or third roll by now. It's shiny on one side, that's the paper backing. It's sticky on the other side. You can rip off a piece, and then what you'll do is tear the backing off, and then you will, and you don't have to be specific or really careful with it. You're just going to put that on the top and then rip off and then peel this off again. Again, you don't have to be super careful or specific. Just stick it on there. If the end gets underneath, not a big deal. Because what you're doing is making your hoop sticky. So we'll do some lining up and centering here in just a minute. But I wanted to show how you apply the tape. So funny enough, I obviously have multiple hoops here. Here's one that's actually had the basting tape on the back for a while. Actually, this has been sitting probably for a few months. But the reason I like the basting tape is, so that's been on there for a long time. It doesn't, it doesn't stick permanently to fabrics. And then you can just peel that off, and then there's no sticky residue there on your hoop either. So this actually, I think the last time I used this, this tip actually comes from, if you've ever taken a quilting in the hoop class. So you can actually quilt your quilts in the hoop. This is one way to make sure that things line up. So let's actually get down and see how this works. So a lot of times we'll clear our space here. So a lot of times when we're embroidering, in this particular instance, I just have, this is a 9.5 inch square of quilting cotton. But a lot of times we're not actually embroidering on something that we get to square up afterwards. It may be a pre-made pillow that you picked up at a store somewhere that you want to put, you want to center your family's monogram on, or a towel, or a tote bag, or especially this time of year, backpacks are big. So when you're lining things up, you want to make sure that when you hoop that you don't get off center. So the first thing, one of the rulers that I really like to use, so we'll just assume for demonstration purposes that we're going to square this up to 8.5 inches afterwards. So I'm going to mark my crosshairs. So since I only have 9.5 inches of fabric each way, if I were to just hoop this willy-nilly and then try to trim 8.5 inches square after I'm finished, it's possible if I hooped it a little bit this way or that way. You see where I could get, if I got off just a little bit, I wouldn't be able to trim up, and that embroidery would be, wouldn't be usable. So let's go ahead and center this up as if we're going to trim this to 8.5 inches after we're done. So this particular ruler, this is the fussy cut and square up ruler. So the reason I like this ruler, this is just an all-purpose ruler. The reason I like this better than a quilting square, for this purpose, a quilting, if you have an 8.5 inch ruler or whatever size you're doing at home, it's going to work perfectly. I like this for after the fact when you're trimming up, because these black lines show you what your finished block will look like, what your finished, seam allowance once you sew your seam. You can't see it because it's on the white, but where these drilled holes are, they're white dotted lines between there. So you can actually, if you needed a 1.5 inch square, even though this is an 8.5 inch ruler, you can make a dot in each corner and then cut your 1.5 inch square. You see what your design would look like in the one, and it goes in 1 inch increments all the way this way. So I use these a lot for squaring up or centering embroidery designs after I've already made them. But in our case here, we're not doing that, so we'll set that aside. If you want to learn more about this ruler, let me know. I'd be happy to do a video on them. I think I've done a couple of videos in the past. They're one of my favorites. They are in the shop as well. I think a 6.5 inch and an 8.5 inch. So now that we've made these little hatch marks to try to find the center of our 8.5, we'll just make sure really that we're not going to go outside of where we need to be. I'm using a friction heat erase pen. There's a lot of different friction options. This one I picked up, I don't even know where. I think these two came from Target. But the one thing, these are heat erase. I know some people have said, okay, if your design gets cold, like if you put it in the freezer, the design will come, the will come back. But it just removes with the iron. I haven't had any problem with it. But the one thing to note is if you're going to use fusible stabilizer, be sure to fuse your stabilizer first, because if you go to all the trouble of making your hatch marks and then you iron on your stabilizer, all your marks are going to disappear. So we'll go ahead. We've got our marks here. So a lot of times I just make no rhyme or reason to the size, because they're gonna erase cleanly anyway. But those little tick marks that I made, I'm just gonna line those up. So now I have a nice crosshatch there to line up. So one of the problems with hooping, especially if you have a loose stabilizer, is when you go to hoop. This is my sticky one here. Let's see, this one's still sticky, but not as sticky. But when you go to hoop, you can't exactly see underneath where your bottom hoop is. So you can shift, you can get kind of crooked, and you may have to readjust and start over. What's great about the sticky tape here is I can kind of see where my crosshatch is. I can even extend this out if I wanted to. So if you really want to cheat in a good way, extend those lines out to the width and length of your hoop, and then your hoop will have on it little marks to line it up. So in this particular case, we're just lining it up here and here, and now we just stick that down. Now I'm going to show you. So when you unhoop, you'll have no problem. It just comes off. Think of it as adhesive, a lot like a Post-it note. It just comes. So let me stick it down. Comes right up. So, but when you stick it down nice and see we're nice and centered, I can pick that up so that when I go to put it in my bottom hoop, see, everything goes in nicely and I don't have to worry about shift, because these bottom pieces are all stuck together. The stabilizer is stuck to the fabric is stuck to the inner ring. So when you hoop, everything goes in nicely. I do want to take a second and talk a little bit about tension, hooping tension. One of the things and one of the mistakes that I made a lot when I was a new embroiderer, and I think what I see a lot of people making, is really cranking that hoop tension up, or putting things in the hoop and then pulling on it and tugging. That's how you end up with distortion and some problems. So instead of, kind of putting your hoop in and tugging at the edges to make it tighter, or just cranking on this after you have it in, because if you crank on the hoop and make it tighter after you already have this in there, you're gonna make some crinkles and wrinkles for yourself. So what I do before I do kind of my final hooping is, a lot of times I will hoop my fabric first and get it to the right tension. So then if it needs to be a little bit tighter, a little bit looser, I'll adjust it while it's in here, take it back out, and then you should be able to, when you hoop, just push in with two hands firmly like that, and you should have a little bit of give. It shouldn't be tight as a drum. If it's tight as a drum, if it doesn't have any give, you may have some registration problems, because when it's so tight, it's going to loosen itself up a little bit in the machine. So that little tip of just hooping and working with the knob to get your hoop to the right size before you do your final hooping. So with that, generally I do that kind of work before I do my center lines or anything like that. I'll just take my fabric and stabilizer and kind of hoop and hoop and hoop again until it's, you know, it's really the right size. You're kind of making this outer ring the right size for the thickness of your stabilizer in your fabric, so that you can just push that inner ring in nicely, and you've got good tension where there's tension, but it's not tight as a drum. So one of the ways, if you are constantly having problems with design registration, and let me show an extreme example from tomorrow's examples here. We'll cheat a little bit. When I say design registration, what I mean is, this one I actually put the hoop in one way and then the opposite way to show an extreme example of when your lines don't line up. But if you're having design registration problems where you're just a smidge off here or a smidge off there, and you can't understand, if you haven't taken the hoop out of the machine and you don't understand why your lines aren't lining up the way they should, whether it's applique, whether it's the outline of an embroidery, chances are you're hooping your fabric too tight. So one of the things you can do to practice good hooping is get some stripe fabric and practice hooping. If your stripes are distorted, you're hooping too tight. If you hoop and your stripes are still straight, then you're perfectly fine. So there's another if you're hooping and your stripes are straight and you're still having registration problems even when you follow that process, then there's some other troubleshooting steps you need to take, because it's definitely not your hoop tension at that point. All right. So with that, we'll pretend we've taken this to the embroidery machine and embroidered. Now when we unhoop, what we'll do, just take this off. We'll go over and iron it. That'll get rid of all of our marks. And because we had everything centered, we'll have no problem finding the center of our design and cutting things out. So thanks so much, guys, for joining me for today's hoop hack with our basting tape. If you have any other machine embroidery questions, please feel free, shoot me a message. I'd be happy to help. And if you want to try out basting tape, I think right now it's $4.50 in the Monograms for Makers shop and Etsy. So if you have any questions, just give me a holler. Thanks so much. Take care.